Have you ever noticed what happens when you get hurt badly enough? You don't always get angry. You don't always cry. Sometimes you just get quiet. You stop explaining, you stop arguing, you stop trying to make the other person understand what they did. You might still smile. You might still answer when someone talks to you. But something changes. You become harder to reach. And the strange part is, people may not even realize you're hurt. They just think you're being distant, cold, different. Meanwhile, inside your head, you're replaying the conversation over and over, wondering how someone can make you feel this way and whether explaining it would even change anything. If you've ever gone silent after being hurt, psychology says there's a reason for it. Because sometimes silence isn't about having nothing to say. It's about having too much to say and not knowing if it's safe to say it. Think about the last time someone disappointed you. Maybe it was someone you trusted. Maybe they said something that crossed the line. Maybe they ignored something that mattered to you. Maybe you finally opened up about something personal, and their reaction made you regret being vulnerable in the first place. Your first instinct might not have been to fight. It might have been to pull back. You stop texting first. You stop explaining yourself. You stop sharing little things about your day. You don't announce that you're upset. You just become quieter. And if someone asks, "What's wrong?" you might say, "Nothing." Not because nothing happened, because explaining what happened feels exhausting. And maybe you're thinking, if I have to explain why that hurt me, maybe you weren't paying attention in the first place. That's a very human reaction, because when you're hurt, you're not only dealing with the original pain, you're also deciding whether the person who caused it is emotionally safe enough to see the pain. That's where things get interesting. Psychologists often talk about emotional regulation, which is basically your ability to manage what you're feeling without letting the emotion completely control your behavior. And when you go quiet, you may actually be trying to regulate yourself. You're creating distance between what happened and what you're about to say. Because you know, if you speak while you're still angry or hurt, you might say something you don't mean. So you wait, you go quiet, you think. You replay everything, and eventually you hope the emotion becomes easier to understand. That's the healthy version of silence. But there's another version, the one where you don't go quiet to understand your feelings. You go quiet because you're afraid of what will happen if you express them. Maybe you've learned that speaking up doesn't change anything. Maybe you've been told you're too sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic. Maybe every time you tried to explain yourself, the conversation somehow became about your reaction instead of what caused it. So eventually, you stopped explaining. And that's when silence becomes a defense. You don't think, "I want to punish this person." You think, "What's the point?" That's a completely different feeling. Because anger still expects something. Anger says, "See what you did." Silence sometimes says, "I don't think you'll understand." And there's a loneliness inside that. You may desperately want someone to notice that you're hurt, while simultaneously hoping they don't ask you about it. You want them to come closer, but you also don't want to risk being misunderstood again. So you create this strange distance where you're waiting to see whether they'll notice without being told. And this is where things can get complicated, because the other person sees your silence. They don't see everything happening underneath it. They may think you're punishing them. You may think you're protecting yourself. They're waiting for you to talk. You're waiting for them to realize. And now two people are sitting in the same emotional room, neither one moving. This is one of the reasons unspoken hurt can become so powerful. Your brain hates unfinished emotional situations. It keeps returning to them. What did they mean? Did I overreact? Should I have said something? Why did they do that? Would they apologize if I told them? Maybe I'm being dramatic. And suddenly, you're having an entire conversation in your head that the other person doesn't even know exists. You can spend hours constructing the perfect explanation, and then never send it. That's not because you don't care. Sometimes it's because you care too much. You want the words to be perfect. You want them to finally understand. You want them to realize that it wasn't just what they said. It was what it meant. It meant you didn't feel considered. It meant you didn't feel safe. It meant something you trusted them with suddenly didn't feel protected anymore. And how do you explain all of that in a text? So you don't. You go quiet.
There's another reason you might respond this way. You may have a strong need for emotional self-protection. When you're hurt, your brain starts asking a very simple question. Do I want to risk being vulnerable with this person again? And if the answer isn't clear, you pull back. You reveal less. You share less. You watch more. You start paying attention to their behavior instead of their words. You're quietly collecting evidence. Do they notice? Do they check in? Do they take responsibility? Do they care? Do they act like nothing happened? And sometimes that observation tells you more than an argument ever could, because when you stop explaining everything, you start noticing what people do without being asked. But here's where you need to be careful. Silence can protect you. It can also isolate you. If you never tell anyone what hurts you, people don't get the opportunity to understand you better. You may believe you're giving them a chance to figure it out themselves, but most people aren't mind readers. They may genuinely have no idea what happened, and then your silence becomes a wall they don't know how to get through. This is especially difficult if you've been hurt before, because past experiences can change how you interpret present ones. If someone has repeatedly ignored your feelings in the past, a small disappointment today can feel much bigger. Your brain isn't only responding to what happened 5 minutes ago, it's remembering what happened before. So maybe someone takes longer than usual to respond. For someone else, it's nothing. For you, it might trigger that old feeling. Here we go again. And suddenly you withdraw. Not necessarily because this person did something terrible, because your nervous system recognizes a pattern. That's why emotional reactions can sometimes seem bigger than the event itself. The current situation may be small, the history behind it isn't. And that doesn't mean you're overreacting. It means there's context. But there's something else you might recognize. When you're hurt, you may become incredibly calm, almost too calm. You don't yell, you don't argue, you just say, "It's okay." And something about the way you say it makes the other person realize it probably isn't okay. You've already gone past the point of arguing. You've started emotionally stepping away. And that's why the quiet person can sometimes be misunderstood. People assume the loudest person is the one who's most affected, but sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes the moment you stop fighting is the moment you've become the most hurt, because you've stopped trying to convince someone to care. And that can be a very different kind of pain. There's a phrase people often use: "I don't care anymore." But sometimes you care deeply. You just don't want to keep paying the emotional price of showing it. So you become quieter. You lower your expectations. You stop reaching. You stop asking. You tell yourself it's easier this way. And maybe for a while, it is. But eventually you have to ask yourself whether you're protecting your peace or slowly teaching yourself not to trust anyone. Because if every disappointment makes you shut down completely, you might eventually build a life where nobody can hurt you, but nobody can really know you either. And that's not peace. That's isolation wearing the clothes of peace. You don't have to become someone who tells everyone everything. You don't need to explain every emotion the second you feel it. And you absolutely don't have to stay in conversations where you're being disrespected. Sometimes walking away is healthy. Sometimes silence is a boundary. But with the people you genuinely care about, there is another option. You can say, "That hurt me, and I need some time before I talk about it." That's enough. You don't have to explain the entire history of your emotions. You don't have to make your pain sound reasonable. You can simply let someone know that something happened inside you, because the goal isn't to stop being quiet. The goal is to make sure your silence is a choice, not the only way you know how to protect yourself. And maybe that's the deeper psychology behind people who become quiet when they're hurt. You're not necessarily trying to punish anyone. You're trying to regain control over something that suddenly made you feel emotionally exposed. You're processing. You're protecting. You're watching. You're trying to figure out whether it's safe to come closer again. And honestly, that doesn't make you cold. It probably means connection matters more to you than you let people see. Because if you didn't care, you wouldn't need to withdraw. You'd simply walk away. The silence exists because something mattered. Someone mattered. And something inside you is trying to figure out what to do with the fact that it hurt. So the next time you become unusually quiet after someone hurts you, don't immediately judge yourself for it. Ask yourself one simple question. Am I quiet because I need space to understand what I feel, or because I've stopped believing I'll be understood? Those are two very different kinds of silence. One gives you time to come back to yourself. The other slowly teaches you to disappear. And you deserve relationships where you don't have to disappear just to feel safe. If you enjoy understanding human behavior, subscribe. And honestly, when you're deeply hurt, do you go quiet because you need time to process, or because you've learned that explaining your feelings